floor is yours.
Okay, not lecture. I was asked by a number of people, so I'm using our coffee break. So I make a couple of points because, and then you simply ask me questions, and I will be glad to answer. So I was born in Donetsk, then it was called Stalino, where all these battles are taking place now. All these cities which are destroyed or going to be destroyed. It's all the places of my childhood. Mariupol, which is fully, almost destroyed fully. It was our summer camp town. It was. So it's all very dear to me. But except from this, I grew in Ukraine and I studied and was arrested in Moscow. And I met Putin when he was the head of FSB on his initiative. And then when he was president and I minister in Israeli government. But as he once told me, I'm so open with you not because you're a minister, but because I read the protocols of your interrogations. He's KGB, you have to. And so that's the source of his respect, yeah? So I really accept it as a big compliment. But Putin, whom I met between 1999 and 2005, he was different. What he was different? Of course, he was KGB guy with all what follows. He was very smart, and he was giving me answers which were not traditional about antisemitism and so on. But he was looking for recognition by the West. He desperately wanted to bring back Russia into the small club of superpowers, and he wanted to be recognized. And in fact, I believe he was meeting with me mainly because he knew that I have good relations with Bush, and that this is another way to reach people in the West and to say that we are different, accept us as equal. But it doesn't matter whether the West made mistakes or not. What happened with the years, he found out that Bush and Merkel and all the others who were making him problems, they all go. 4 years, 8 years, and then they disappear. And he's the only one who is forever. So he started feeling himself as the strongest leader in the world, because he's forever, and he made sure, and that's he spent his all first years in the power to make sure that he will be the only one. And if you need for this to take full control over the press, you take over the finances of the candidates, you take it. If you need to change constitution, he is also doing it. And he said a number of times that the biggest tragedy of the 20th century is falling of the Soviet Union, disappearing of the Soviet Union. And now he had a mission. As the strongest leader in the world, his mission is to restore Russian Empire. And he was doing it fighting in Chechnya, he was doing it fighting in Georgia. He solved the problem with Belarus, and then the most difficult place, of course, challenging place is Ukraine. And he was waiting for the sign of weakness from the West, because he understood it will be very serious. This moment of weakness of the West in his mind came when Obama threatened that only if Syria will use chemical weapons, that's it, that's the war. And then he didn't deliver. And the fact that American president put the red line and didn't cross it was the best sign for him that America will not interfere. And he did two things almost simultaneously. He brought his troops to Syria and built the military base, which controls until this day the airspace above Syria. And he took Crimea, and he was checking for a few weeks, like increasing the conversation and sending some people as civilians, and people as partisans, and soldiers. And then, in accordance with the desire of people, he entered Crimea when it became clear to him that the West will not like it, but will not do anything. And that more or less happened. And then he, with all the sanctions, but he believed that he can live with this. And he started very slow developing war in Donbass, but waiting for another moment of weakness. And this moment came, in his opinion, I know that the discussion in Kremlin, that when Americans left Afghanistan. Not the fact that they left, but the fact how they left. And these pictures of the helpless American army and the clear message was that in the near future, America will not be involved in any war. And then he declared, and it was the most open speech which he ever did, opening his mind. He said that Ukrainians are not a nation. It is artificial creature of Soviet Union in the first years. By the way, it's similar if you read Molotov, the minister who made a deal with Ribbentrop. He then said in his reports to Soviet leaders that Poland is not a nation. It's artificial creature of Versailles Treaty, and the time has come to deal with this. And Putin made almost similar, very strong and frightening speech that the time has come to bring Ukraine where it really belongs, to Russian Empire. Of course, there were some big surprises for him because for a few years already, he is not talking to anybody who doesn't agree with him. Simply, people will not be able to get a meeting. And also, he has very different understanding about Ukrainians. He thought that they would be resisting as everybody, but really the people of Ukraine, it doesn't matter to them. So to expect that Ukraine will become such a strong and proud nation when he thought that they are not really a nation was a big surprise. I think for him was surprised, though he will never recognize that Russian army is so corrupt that it can't really fight. And the thought that he didn't expect that the West, in the end, he threatened them with nuclear war. He thought that this threat will paralyze them. And it did paralyze them for a couple of weeks, but then the level of solidarity is high. Okay, that's about now. And I really believe that he made a lot to bring Ukraine more as a nation and to the center of world history than ever before in the 1,000 years of Ukrainian history. And at the same time, he damaged a lot to Russia, Russian civilization, Russian culture. And I think it will take dozens of years before the Russia will be able to restore its name. Now, what's interesting, another remark which I want to make, that after the Soviet Union fell, developments in Russia and Ukraine are in many ways very similar. Very weak civil institutions, corruption, a close connection between oligarchs and politicians, a lot of very similar things. Non-transparent economy. What is the difference? The difference, in fact, is only one. While there were 6 presidents in Ukraine, in Russia it was 1 president, meaning that Ukrainians were unhappy with the corruption of their presidents. Approximately a year and a half after all the presidents are coming to power, there starts press dissatisfaction, people go to Maidan Square, and then they go to elections. So with a very big civil society, they were fighting for one right, or they defended one right. They have the right to elect, so their leaders depend on them. And that's why there were 6 presidents replacing one another. And by the way, I'm not sure that the fate of Zelensky, if it didn't happen of him, would not be the same, because he was already suspected that he has his own oligarchs, and there was not much democracy except from the fact that president can be re-elected. And in Russia, it was different. Putin, the KGB man, devoted a lot of efforts to guarantee that there will be no elections. But it's interesting that this only difference is so fundamental that one nation where people depend on the dictator, their nationalism is imperialist nationalism, because as I was speaking in the morning, dictators need external enemy. And the other nation, where leaders depend on the nation, the nationalism is the one which is helping to fight for freedom. And in this big debate which we all had, and I was involved in it for many years, what is good nationalism and bad nationalism, it's like ideal example nationalism, how nationalism looks under dictatorship and democracy, whether it is the tool for imperialism or whether it is the tool for building a proud nation. Okay, that's But I want to say, if you want to ask questions, I'm glad to. Yeah.
So I have two questions. Firstly, just about, I've been reporting quite a bit in Ukraine since the war began, and I was in Donbass area a few weeks ago. And the sense which I got, at least at that time, it was just before Lysychansk fell, was that the Ukrainians I was speaking to were saying, while they had an amazing run of success, of course, in March and April around Kiev, that the Russians had reverted to a type of warfare with which they are comfortable, which is these massive artillery barrages and then the slow crawling advance. And that the Ukrainians, at that time at least, were saying they were yet to find a solution to that. So I guess what I'd like to ask you is, where do you think the war is heading? Is there a possibility of further Russian advances in Donbass? Or do you take seriously the notion of a Ukrainian counter-offensive towards Kherson, which many people are talking about now? So I'd like your view on that. The second question is about Israel, of course, and I'd very much like your thoughts on the Israeli response to this and your views on whether that's been the correct response or whether you'd like to have seen a different one.
Okay, as to first question, what was surprising, I think, for everybody, and first of all for Russians, that in the first part of the war, that in all face-to-face meetings between Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainians were victorious. And it doesn't matter whether they had 3 times, 5 times advantage in soldiers, but the spirit and professionalism was all on the Ukrainian side. So in the second phase, they really changed the tactics. They move only after they destroyed everything. It's very cruel, but as long as they had overwhelming advantage in artillery for long distances, it worked. But even if it worked, you have to appreciate the power and courage of Ukrainians. In the last months, they moved, with all the big victories that was informed, less than 10 kilometers. You understand? They are destroying everything. They had overwhelming power in artillery in the beginning. They had also overwhelming power in the air, which they don't have now. And they moved like 250 meters a day, and every day there is a lot of attacks. So they have to wait and give artillery to work again. So the answer on this is only that Ukraine will have artillery. They now, in the last weeks, they are getting. When I was in Washington a few weeks after the war, in fact, on Jewish matters, but in fact, going and lobbying for Ukraine with leading senators, there was a lot of confusion. Everybody wanted to help to Ukraine, but China was saying, watching whether it will irritate Russia, whether it will mean that we are now in direct war. If we'll give them artillery which is fighting for 25 kilometers, maybe it's okay, but 100 kilometers is already World War III. Well, it's all behind us. And America is giving them now artillery which is by far better than Russian artillery. First of all, because it's exact. And second, it goes now on 50, 60, 70 kilometers, and probably the potential is much bigger. So that, if it will continue, and if they will have, the Russians will have not 10 times advantage in artillery, but only, let's say, 3 times, but taking into account the quality of this artillery, I believe that the tide will be turned around. And of course, Kherson is a good example where they could destroy the bridges. You understand that for artillery to destroy the bridges, which are 30, 40 kilometers, Russians don't have such artillery, which can be so exact. So I believe that if the West will succeed to continue with the sanctions, let's say for half a year, which is a big if, and if the West will continue giving the best weapon, now they are not afraid to give the best weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine has a big chance to win. What means win? They will not go to conquer Moscow, of course, but they'll throw Russian army from its border. I believe there is a big chance, but the price, of course, which Ukrainians are paying is tremendous. And how many Mariupols there will be, it's a question, especially that Putin doesn't have any restrictions of the code of war or what is permitted, not permitted. If they need to kill hundreds of prisoners of war and blame Ukraine, well, they're doing it without hesitation. By the way, that continues the old tradition of Stalin and the others who were doing it very easily, and they're doing it very easily. Your second question, well, on the record, from the very first day, I disagreed with position of the West, but also with the position of Israel to display any caution. That's the war for the future of the free world. That's not some kind of local conflict, and the free world has to be mobilized. And that's why I'm definitely in disagreement with many of our. On the other hand, I have to say that Israel has very serious reason to be so cautious. And those who have to be blamed for this reason is the free world. Free world, 8 years ago, accepted practically without any serious attempt to stop Russia, to establish their control over Syria, and to control all the skies. As a result, Iran, which approximately at the same time started building bases of Hezbollah and of its own in Syria, and Israeli army had to, and that's a real threat. That's when Putin is threatening with nuclear war, it's nothing, it's blackmail. But Iranian leaders are really ready to destroy Israel, even if it means to commit suicide for them. They believe in the next world. Putin doesn't believe in the next world, but they do believe. So their compensation will be there. And so Israel takes it very seriously. And we are practically every week, twice or three times, our airplanes are attacking Iranian bases. And strategic agreement which was reached with Putin after the West permitted Putin to establish control was that Putin doesn't try to interfere with our fight with Iran. And I believe that Putin had his own interests. He wants to control Syria. He doesn't want that Iran will control Syria. But that's a very serious consideration, which in Israel they say that our first obligation of our government is to guarantee the survival of Israel. And we didn't want Putin in Syria. We didn't want his control. The free world accepted. More than the free world now is negotiating the deal with Iran, what means that all the hundreds of $billions which are taken from Putin, in fact, will be given to Iran. So don't teach us the moral. That's more or less position. I disagree with this because I believe that the challenge is much bigger than all this. But I definitely can understand it. Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Irwin is.
Irwin.
We have you, Irwin, the floor.
I'm taking your time. I'm sorry. For those who don't know, Irwin Cotler was my lawyer when I was in prison, and he, well, yeah, and by the way, of course I didn't know it, but he built my case in such a way that all the organizations in the world could use it as a serious juridical case, even when KGB was not telling everything. And after this, Irwin was the lawyer of Nelson Mandela, Badawi in these days, and many others. Okay. Let's, in a few minutes, I'll have to give the turn to Irwin. So if you have questions, please. Yeah. Yeah.
As you know, President Joe Biden said, well, maybe if it's a sort of a limited incursion, words to that effect, it's not too bad if Russia invades.
Yeah, well, look, that was Biden before the war. Biden before the war was absolute catastrophe, absolute. But Biden, after, let's say, months after the war, was very good, and he deserves a lot of credit for keeping, Europe also in the first months was very weak, France was weak, Germany was super weak. Biden took the initiative, and he deserves credit. Before, I think he deserves being blamed for the fact that Putin saw that his blackmail works and started the war. Okay. Okay, but that's shortly, but we can go into the details after. Okay, I answered all the questions, we solved the problems. Now only we have to guarantee the victory of... Okay. Irwin.
Thank you, Natan. Thank you very much. And we're very fortunate. We're going to have a special event this evening with Natan and Dr. Ali. Pardon?
Irwin saying something, I didn't hear,
Yeah.
so probably there is no sound.
Recording in progress.
Irwin, you can hear us?
I hear you well. I don't know if you
Excellent.
hear me.
We hear you now, yeah.
How is your health?
Okay.
How are you feeling? Natan wants to know how you are.
Yeah.
In front of 40
Getting
people.
better.
Getting better. Good. You look well. So, I'll be brief. I'll introduce you Irwin really quickly and then you'll have the floor. So, it's really an honor. I wish you were here, Irwin. So, Irwin, you're in Montreal?
In Montreal.
Okay. So, Irwin Cotler was a professor of human rights in the law school at McGill University. He's an internationally renowned human rights activist and legal scholar. As Natan said, he was his lawyer. Irwin was his lawyer when he was in prison in the Soviet Union. He was also Nelson Mandela's lawyer. The list goes on and on. Very active in Rwanda, Darfur, and human rights issues around the world. He's also currently the ambassador for Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism for the Canadian government. He was a minister of justice. He's written widely, spoken widely. He helped to create the IRA definition and to promote it internationally. He created a very important organization of parliamentarians that combats anti-Semitism and was instrumental in creating legislation around the world to combat contemporary anti-Semitism. So Irwin, for decades, has really been at the forefront of fighting for human rights, including anti-Semitism. So, Irwin, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here. Next year, you got to be here in person. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles, for those kind words. Exaggerated, but I appreciate it as a reflection of friendship. As you mentioned, I'm particularly
Actually, understated.
regretful. I'm particularly regretful that I can't be there in person. When I see Natan, the familiar faces around the table, I know that the real learning comes from these in-person encounters and exchanges, and I'm being bereft by that, having had COVID, therefore unable to participate there in person. But I'm trying to follow as best I can, and I want to commend you for organizing yet another particularly timely and significant gathering. Some months ago, on the eve of Yom HaShoah, National Holocaust Remembrance Day, I participated in the first ever gathering of special envoys to combat anti-Semitism who were convened in Yad Vashem. As we were about to begin our meeting, we were exposed to a series of annual reports on anti-Semitism that had just emerged and were remarkably similar in their compelling findings. For example, the annual audit on anti-Semitism of the League of Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada found the highest level of anti-Semitism in Canada since they began their audits over 40 years ago. The Anti-Defamation League in the US, which released its report, found a similar finding, and that was true also with regards to Europe. Australia, that was there, shared that there had been a 35% increase in anti-Semitism in the last year alone. So we saw this globalized escalation of anti-Semitism, and also in the reports and their findings were that there was a dramatic increase in violent acts of anti-Semitism, an increase in hate crimes targeting Jews, where, for example, Jews might form, as they do in Canada, just a little over 1% findings in the US and elsewhere. Also, an exponential increase in online hate, but the worst finding regarding that particular dramatic index was that most of the hate in the social media, in fact, is not removed. So it's a standing continuing incitement to hate. And then all the reports, whether from the US, Canada, or Europe, reported a tipping point in anti-Semitism as a result of the May 2021 Hamas Israel war at the time. But as we heard these reports and shared them, one of the participants made a very telling remark which underpins my own comments today. He said, you know, we are witnessing, as we've seen in these findings, a global escalation in anti-Semitism. At the same time, as he put it, we have more forces combating anti-Semitism than ever before. We never had, years ago, any special envoys. Now, special envoys from Latin America to North America to Europe are convening as a group. We never had national action plans to combat anti-Semitism. We now have countries formulating a national action plans to combat anti-Semitism. We didn't have IRA or an IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. We now have a European Commission action plan to combat anti-Semitism, and so on. In a word, how do we account for this paradox? How do we account for the fact that we have an increasing globalization of anti-Semitism, and yet, if you will, an increased set of forces to combat anti-Semitism? And so what I'd like to do with you is using Canada also as a case study to discuss what should be our strategy at this point, and what is the role of national strategies in combating anti-Semitism. I think the first thing we need to do, and that's why this convening that you have now in Oxford is so important. The first thing we have to do, and you are doing it best there, is to appreciate the origin, the nature, the essence, and the impact of anti-Semitism. For anti-Semitism is not only, as I'm sure you've been sharing with the oldest, longest, most enduring, most global, most toxic, and most lethal of hatreds, and one which mutates and metastasizes over time, but one that is anchored in one generic, foundational, historical, conspiratorial trope. I'm not saying there are not others, but one foundational, conventional trope across the ages. And that is the Jews as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil, reflecting and representing whatever is the particular zeitgeist at any given moment in time. And so when Christianity, Christian religion was a zeitgeist, so the Jews were held to be guilty of deicide. When you had the Black Plague, the Jews were the poisoners of the wells. When race emerged as the zeitgeist, then the Jews were held to be subhuman, non-Aryan, and the like. But when in the 70s, and this is the burden of my remarks today, human rights emerged, as I wrote at the time, as a new secular religion of our time. When Congressman Father Robert Drinan wrote at the time in his book on the history and hopes of the human rights revolution, published in 1976, that the elevation of human rights into an international juridical norm is the most dramatic development in contemporary jurisprudence, as he put it. When you had that human rights revolution, then what was happening at the time was the Jew among the nations, Israel, emerging and being portrayed as the major human rights violator of the resolution of the UN General Assembly, which had its origins in much of the Soviet anti-Semitism at the time, including its own weaponization, which is not as well known, of the apartheid libel then. I'm referring to the human rights and the laundering of anti-Semitism under the cover of human rights that was taking place, in fact, was being laundered, if I may put it, under the protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, the struggle against racism, in a word, the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal human values themselves. Let me just give you a snapshot from the year before the Zionism is Racism resolution at the UN, 1974. And you should appreciate that what I'm sharing with you has been happening annually ever since. And so what we've been having here is a multiplier effect in this laundry of anti-Semitism and the universal public values. And so it was then that Israel was held out to be the enemy of labor. Evidence? The resolution then of the International Labor Organization condemning Israeli suppression of Palestinian trade unionism. The enemy of health. Evidence? The resolution of the World Health Organization condemning Israeli suppression of the health rights of Palestinians. May I add that 2 years ago, Israel was held out to be the worst violator of health rights in the world. In fact, the only violator of health rights in the world. The enemy of culture. Evidence? The resolution of UNESCO condemning Israeli desecration of Palestinian historic sites in the West Bank and Jerusalem. The enemy of women. Evidence? The resolution of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, referencing Israel's suppression of the rights of Palestinian women. I could use the word alleged in each of these things, but they in fact were determinations that were made. And just 2 weeks ago, Israel was held out to be by the UN Economic and Social Council the only violator of women's rights in the world. The enemy of peace. Evidence, the resolution of the UN General Assembly condemning Israel as a non-peace-loving nation. And the enemy of human rights. Evidence, the resolution of the then UN Commission on Human Rights, now in its successor form as the UN Council on Human Rights, condemning mass Israeli violation of human rights. And so you had it that Israel, as the enemy of labor, health, culture, women, peace, and human rights, Israel, as the enemy of all that is good, was in effect the embodiment of all that is evil. None of this is intended to suggest, and I wouldn't want to have it inferred from anything that I say, that somehow Israel is to be above the law, or that Israel is not to be held, or the Jewish people not to be held accountable for any violations of human rights and humanitarian law like any other state. That's the point, like any other state. But what we have been witnessing is not that anyone should seek that Israel and the Jewish people be above the law, but that they're being systematically denied equality before the law in the international arena. Not that Israel should respect human rights, which she must, but that the rights of Israel deserve equal respect. Not that human rights standards should not be applied to Israel. They must, but that these standards must be applied equally to everyone else. And so we began to witness what I would call and wrote about at the time, then in the 70s, for the reasons I have now shared with you, but many more that time does not permit, the birth of what I characterized then and share now as the new anti-Semitism. In other words, traditional or classical anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews to live as equal members in whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Israel and the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations. What is common to both forms of anti-Semitism, traditional and new, is discrimination. All that has happened is that it has moved from discrimination against Jews as individuals to discrimination against Jews as a people, and reverberating back against Jews as individuals. At this point, what we have to appreciate is that this process that I've described to you has been one that has continued inexorably, sometimes imperceptibly, often indulgently, for over the last 50 years. And you have to appreciate how this critical mass of indictment, of the laundry of anti-Semitism under universal human values, has its impact. And I mentioned to you under the protective cover of the UN, etc. Let me give you one example. I can give many that could take up all the time. I was a member of the Canadian delegation to the UN over 20 years ago, when in the annual ritual of the General Assembly, some 20 resolutions were passed against one member state, which happened to be Israel, and 5 resolutions passed and adopted against the rest of the world combined. Now, I mention this because the resolution just isn't rubber stamped in one day. It goes through a process of hearings at different committees, etc. Now, the members of the Canadian delegation, of which I was part, like members of many of the UN delegations, come to the United Nations and to the understanding of the Middle East very often as uninformed, if not somewhat misinformed, as tabula rasa. And so they are open to this drumbeat of indictment that they hear day after day over a 3-month period, which in the end culminates in a resolution of condemnation, or 20 resolutions of condemnation. And when you multiply that almost every week of every year, almost every day of every year, there is some UN human rights agency somewhere passing a resolution of indictment, with the massive exposure to that process and drumbeat of indictment, and thereby willy-nilly, innocently internalizing those indictments, then you can appreciate how some 50 years later now, after the human rights revolution in the 70s, where Israel was held out, as I said, as the meta human rights violator of our time, this process has metastasized into what we are now witnessing. And let me say that this 50-year process has been accelerated and incentivized by 2 tipping points that I will deal with now. The first was the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, in September 2001. I was there as a member of the Canadian delegation and participated in all 3 fora that took place at Durban. The 3 fora were an intergovernmental fora, an NGO fora, and a student fora. I have to say that when it was first announced in the late 90s that there was going to be a World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, in September 2001, I greeted this announcement with interest, if not anticipation and excitement. This was going to be the first international human rights conference of the 21st century, with anti-racism as its organizing theme. This was going to be the first international law conference of the 21st century. And it was going to take place in Durban, South Africa, the birthplace of apartheid, and it was going to commemorate the dismantling of South African apartheid. And as someone who had been myself arrested in 1981 as part of involvement in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and my involvement with Mandela at the time, For me, this was going to be a homecoming, I felt, of commemoration, if not celebration. But what happened at Durban, to use an oft-abused metaphor, was truly Orwellian. A conference to combat racism and hate turned into a conference of racism and hate against one state and one people. A conference intended to be dedicated to the promotion and protection of international human rights, singled out one state, Israel, one people, the Jewish people, for selective opprobrium and indictment. And a conference that was to commemorate the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, as I said, something that I welcomed and looked forward to, turned into a conference calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. Whenever I share these remembrances, as I am with you now, I can still see the demonstrations, thousands of demonstrators. I can still hear the chants. I can still hear the demonstrations and the chants that the struggle against racism in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against racism in the 21st century now requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. In fact, it was in Durban that the apartheid libel was born in its metastasized manner as part of the international human rights lexicon and advocacy. And there were the placards and the posters with evocative images of classic anti-Semitism juxtaposed with new anti-Semitism, caricatures of Jews with hooked nose, their hands as fangs dripping in blood and money and the like. The distribution of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Jewish students being assaulted and being told you don't belong in the human race. Those of us who were at Durban, I have to say, have been forever transformed. Durban indelibly impacted itself not only on our memory, but on our being. I flew back from Durban to Montreal on September 10th, arriving in the evening. Awoke, as we all did, to 9/11 on September 11th. And I still vividly recall the words of one of my colleagues who had been at the Durban seminar with me, calling me later that day and saying to me, if 9/11 was the Kristallnacht of terror, Durban was the Mein Kampf. And while 9/11 overshadowed Durban, Durban foreshadowed what was going to be the next 20 years of the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal human values. Let me just share with you some outcomes of this laundering immediately after the Durban conference. And so it was that 9/11 was blamed on the Jews, which you may recall in the indictments, false indictments at the time. The UN General Assembly, convening after Durban, adopted yet again 20 resolutions condemnatory of Israel, 5 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. The UN Commission on Human Rights, meeting after Durban, adopted a disproportionate number of condemnatory resolutions in respect of Israel. All of these referencing, of course, outcomes at Durban. And then we had the founding, which is not as well known, of the BDS movement at the University of Michigan at the time, when in that conference, a resolution proposed to support a two-state resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if Israel were to become a democratic state. itself a problematic resolution, was defeated in favor of a resolution calling for the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And what is almost not so known, if it is known at all, was the most egregious indictment of all. And that was, in the aftermath of Durban, the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention, the mainstream of international humanitarian law, met to put one state in the docket of the accused for the first time in the 52 years since the Geneva Convention was adopted. That state was not Russia, it was not China, it was not Syria, it was not, I can go on. The only state put in the docket of the accused was Israel. And I might add that not only did that take place in the immediate aftermath of Durban, but set precedent and principle, because the contracting parties to the Geneva Convention have met twice since. And again, only Israel was put in the docket of the accused and indicted. And again, as I said earlier, I'm not saying that Israel, like any other state, cannot warrant critique and indictment and the like. I'm saying that this egregious singling out of one member state is a standing indictment of the norms of international human rights and humanitarian law. And so Durban, as I tried to share with you, became not only the launching pad for the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal human values, a process which has metastasized these past 20 years, but actually for the weaponization of human rights, for the weaponization of universal human values in the service of anti-Semitism. Let me give you some examples, some of the metrics that were in fact instrumentalized and weaponized under the cover of universal human values in the aftermath of Durban, which included, number one, genocidal anti-Semitism. By genocidal anti-Semitism, I'm referring to the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, embedded in the most dangerous of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, calling for the destruction of one member state, Israel, and the killing of Jews wherever they may be, while at the same time instrumentalizing the hate as targeting a state which itself is being engaging in genocide. And so Israel and the Jewish people became the only state and the only people to be both the targets of genocidal incitement on the one hand, and to be accused of genocide as a people, as a community, as a state, and the other. It's often forgotten, if it was at all ever known, that the 20th century began with the Ayatollah Khamenei saying on January 3rd, 2000, that there can be no resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict without the annihilation of the Jewish state. He did not even use the euphemism of the Zionist entity. And we have had this ongoing repetition of the need to lance this cancerous tumor, Israel and the like. But what is often forgotten is that Iran chaired the 4th regional conference in the run-up to Durban. That these indictments of Israel as a criminal, genocidal, apartheid state were actually adopted in the run-up to Durban in the regional conference in Iran. The whole with impunity and incentivization. A second metric, and I'll be briefer on this one, is that of political anti-Semitism, of which the 4 dimensions of it were in Durban and since, namely the denial of Israel's legitimacy, let alone its right to exist, or the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, let alone the denial of the Jewish people themselves. The third was ideological anti-Semitism, the indictment of Israel as a racist, apartheid, Nazi state. Let's face it, the worst thing that you can say about a person or a country, if you will, is to refer to them as being racist. The very label supplies the indictment. And in this case, with respect to Israel, it is not only the indictment of being racist, but the indictment of apartheid. And apartheid is not used accidentally. For apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. If Israel is an apartheid state, then Israel itself is a crime against humanity. If it is a crime against humanity, it has no right to be. And not only does it have no right to be, but being also a Nazi state, we have an obligation to ensure that it has no right to be. And so the very incitement with respect to apartheid is turned into an obligation with respect to the international community to engage in the dismantling of this apartheid state, which is an assault on our common humanity. Not that anti-Semitism is the assault on the common humanity, but the apartheid state Israel is. And just several days ago, the African National Congress in South Africa not only referenced Israeli massacres of Palestinians in the just concluded Palestinian Islamic Jihad exchange, not only indicted Israel for its war crimes and crimes against humanity and killing of children, but referenced its apartheid nature as being the source of that criminality, and saying that at the forthcoming UN General Assembly in September, South Africa hopes to lead an international mobilization, not only for determination with respect to Israel being an apartheid state, but in fact for taking action against Israel as an apartheid state, thereby normalizing the libel of apartheid even more. And this leads us inexorably into what has become, I would say, demonological anti-Semitism. By demonological anti-Semitism, the referencing of Israel and the Jewish people as the enemy of all that is good and the embodiment of all that is evil in contemporary terms, that can be summed up in the ongoing generic indictment of Israel as a racist, imperialist, colonialist, settler, child murdering, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, Nazi state. Each of these epithets of indictment are increasingly being used collectively in the indictments as I've been sharing them with you. And then finally, and I'm only using 5 metrics, I could have elsewhere written about 10, is what might be called terrorist anti-Semitism, which is not only the targeting of Jews in Israel, but the targeting of Jews globally in anti-Jewish terror. Let me just give you 2 examples. We just recently commemorated the 28th anniversary of the bombing of the Jewish Community Center, AMIA, in Argentina, in 28 years ago, July 1994, which remains the worst terrorist atrocity targeting Jews ever in Latin America, but the worst, as the Minister of Justice of Argentina told me when I visited with him in a commemorative ceremony in Argentina, the worst terrorist atrocity, generally speaking, ever in Argentina. And he said, let there be no mistake about it, this was an anti-Jewish terrorist atrocity. I'm also reminded that we recently commemorated the 20th anniversary of both the bombing of the cafeteria at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. I happened to have been there lecturing at the time. And the bombing also 20 years ago of the hotel in Netanya on the occasion of Passover Seder. And so these are just snapshots of a phenomenon of anti-Jewish terror that has itself globalized and in fact took place in particular in the aftermath also of Durban. I might say that Charles mentioned the IRA definition, that these metrics which I've just been discussing with you, and if I could put it otherwise, the laundry of anti-Semitism and the universal human values prompted the drafting of the IRA definition in the immediate aftermath of Durban. We convened in Stockholm. There were 4 Stockholm conferences on conscience on humanity in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2004. In 2002, after Durban, we convened there a drafting group of Professor Elie Wiesel of blessed memory, Per Ahlmark, former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, and myself to set forth the drafting elements of what became the IRA working definition. And I'll just say one thing about that IRA working definition. It is not only the most comprehensive and authoritative and international consensus definition that we have, but what is less well known, the most democratically represented, because it was adopted over a 20-year period by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, scholars, civil society leaders, and the like. And it remains at this point as a useful, non-binding definition. It's a non-binding legal definition, but a useful asset, resource, and the like, that which you know and as well, if not better, than I do. Let me now bring this up to the present. For 20 years, this process that I described at Durban was incentivizing and metastasizing the laundering of anti-Semitism and the universal human values. We then had a second tipping point after Durban, and that was the Hamas war against Israel in May 2021. I can give you a snapshot from what occurred in Canada at the time, where Jews were targeted in their homes and in their streets, in the campuses and in the communities, where synagogues were torched, Holocaust memorials defaced, cemeteries desecrated, Jewish institutions vandalized, and where we witnessed the highest incidence of both anti-Semitic hate crimes and anti-Semitism in the social media, where, for example, in 1 week alone, in May 2021, you had 17,000 tweets that Israel was right.
Irwin,
At that,
if it's possible, could you take 5 more minutes and we'll open up for Q&A?
yeah, I didn't want to go on this long, is that I was told to speak this long. Frankly, I would have done it much shorter, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
So I embarked on it only, so let me just move quickly to a close. And that is, how do we explain, therefore, the paradox that I began with, namely the globalization of anti-Semitism and its escalation on the one hand, and the enhanced number of forces to combat it on another. Let me close with a series of one-liners. And it's based on my first 18 months of having served as special envoy. I was going to mention that after all the things that I did describe to you, I met with the Prime Minister. We held the first ever, and I think to date, the only national summit to combat anti-Semitism anywhere, in the presence of the Prime Minister, 10 government ministers, parliamentarians from all parties, a diverse expression of the Jewish community. And I gave a talk on a national action plan to combat anti-Semitism, which I'm happy to what I consider compelling moments of that national leadership emergency summit. But let me just conclude by sharing some dynamics which account for this paradox. First, I think we have to appreciate that the conventional paradigm of combating anti-Semitism, from the far right, the far left, radical Islam, while remains true, is insufficient. One of the things that I've witnessed in my first 18 months, but felt it before for all the reasons that I said, is the increasing mainstream, normalization, legitimation of anti-Semitism in the popular culture, and in particular in the campus culture, where human rights is an organizing idiom of the campus culture, something which began, as I said, in the 70s, and I witnessed it then as a Lafayette. The second thing is the phenomenon of the not only globalization of anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, but the intersection of that globalization. That what happens in London and Paris reverberates and even replicates itself in Montreal, Toronto, and elsewhere. Let me give you one example again of many. That when a convoy went through the streets of London in May 2021 saying, "F the Jews will rape your daughters," similar convoys appeared in the streets and Canada saying the same things. These were not accidental, but you had orchestrated phenomenon of the globalization of anti-Semitism. The third was the marginalization of anti-Semitism in the struggle against racism. If you look at the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion committees and the like, then you will find that there is a concern, rightly so, and I found this in government policies and training in Canada as well, whether it be in global affairs or domestic affairs. If you look, you will see a rightly combating of systemic racism against Indigenous people, blacks, peoples of color, Asian Canadians, Muslims, and the like, but a marginalization of the combating of anti-Semitism in this overall struggle against racism. And this is we need to ensure that, in fact, inclusivity also means combating anti-Semitism, in particular because of the manner in which anti-Semitism is the only one of the hatreds itself laundered under the very cover of human rights. The fourth thing is the laundering of anti-Semitism, not only in the cover of human rights, but under anti-racism itself. I'll give you one example that emerged from our national summit to combat anti-Semitism, which the Prime Minister said he was particularly moved by. And that was when a graduate student at the University of Toronto shared his experiences and saying that he himself was what would be called a progressive student, somebody who was part of a left-wing orientation. But he was being asked to choose between his Jewish identity and acceptability into the campus culture. In other words, he was being stereotyped, marginalized, excluded as being part of the white privileged class, acting as an apologist for the white apartheid state of Israel, and forced to choose between admission into the progressive campus culture or being marginalized and victimized because of his white stereotype identity. And then we have, and with this I close, the perfect international storm of the last 2 years. I'm referring here in one-liners the weaponization of the COVID-19 pandemic, so that Israel, the Jewish people, Jews are accused of manufacturing the COVID pandemic, of causing its spread, of profiting from it. The weaponization of social media, which is being increasingly incentivized, and the like. The weaponization of human rights in the campus culture. And as I said, the campus culture is a human rights culture. The apartheid label is particularly scurrilous and prejudicial in a campus culture. Then the pandemic of systemic racism, which is having its own fallout with regard to anti-Semitism, because rather than being engaged in common allyship against systemic racism, some of the other would-be allies are themselves partaking of the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal values. We then have the global political pandemic. I won't go into it, but the pandemic of impunity amidst the global political pandemic, the resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding democracy, assaults on human rights, has its own incentivizing impunity with regard to anti-Semitism. We have the Russia-Ukraine war, where you have the weaponization here too, where the Palestinians are held out to be the Ukrainians and Israel is held out to be the violating Russians, and the misappropriation of symbolism as part of the laundering. And finally, a new phenomenon that we've been witnessing, and that is an evolving religious dimension with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Jews are really accused of storming Al-Aqsa, etc., etc., all of which is further incentivized by the social media and finds expression in terrorist attacks. So I'll conclude by saying that each one of us here, as scholars, as those engagés, involved in the study of anti-Semitism, have a responsibility to expose and unmask this old new anti-Semitism. Not just the anti-Semitism which is prejudicial to Jews, and not seeing anti-Semitism just as prejudicial to Jews, but in fact anti-Semitism as being prejudicial to our common humanity, as being, as Ahmed Shahid put it, the UN Special Rapporteur, Freedom, Religion, Belief, in his landmark report to the UN on anti-Semitism, as being toxic to democracies, as being the canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And as we've learned only too well and repeat sometimes too often without it being fully appreciated, that while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. The struggle to combat anti-Semitism is a struggle for the protection of democracy and our common humanity. Thank you.
Irwin, thank you very much for a very impactful and important presentation. So we'll have some time for Q&A, about 15 minutes. We have to break early for a gala dinner. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please come and sit at the chair so Irwin can see you and I don't have to interpret. So first we have Fantahuna Sefa from Montreal.
Irwin, shalom.
Hello, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. You know,
I wish I were with you. But
yes. Besides Montreal, you and I have been working with the Tabeka project, if you remember. So,
absolutely.
yes. Thank you for the really interesting, as always, in-depth lecture, and we could have kept listening to you for another few hours. My question is, you being lived through this process of fighting against anti-Semitism, working for the well-being of humanity in general. To your opinion, this process of anti-Semitism becoming more and more sophisticated and becoming more escalated, what do you think is not being done right that we are in a situation where we are right now? So we see every time the situation deteriorates, and what are we not doing right, and what should be done? And my next question is, having had the Abraham Accords, and this is a very welcoming news, we're all excited, both the Israelis, the Jewish people, and I believe many of the Arab countries who are in this accord. Do you think this is the beginning of a process where we are actually going to be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel?
Okay, I'll deal with both of those questions, and they're both very pertinent and timely. Let me begin terms of the first thing, what needs to be done. I didn't go into a national action plan that I had released, but let me just excerpt from some of those. You know, most national action plans address the importance of Holocaust education, commemoration, remembrance, and the like, but they don't put enough emphasis on education re anti-Semitism. It's important to have education re the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a paradigm for radical evil, anti-Semitism, paradigm for radical hate. But we need education re anti-Semitism, particularly contemporary anti-Semitism. This is what ISGAP is doing, and that's particularly important. We need as well to understand that the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, because there's been a lot of brushback on it. In other words, it's put everybody on the defensive with a legend. The definition silences speech, that it silences criticism of Israel, etc. What is not appreciated is the IRA working definition, as I said, was born post-Durban as a human rights framework anchored in equality rights law, both equality rights law re traditional anti-Semitism and equality rights re the new anti-Semitism. That's intended, in fact, to protect speech rather than silence speech, to protect the speech of marginalized or excluded Jewish students and their supporters from participation in the campus culture. It's intended to protect criticism. It says expressly that criticism of Israel, like any other state, is protected speech, and so on. So I think we need to educate. It's not only a matter of adopting the IRA definition, it's educating that the IRA definition is itself anchored in human rights and equality rights understanding. I believe that there are important parliamentary principles and precedents that are not well known and that we need to invoke, so it doesn't appear that the combating of anti-Semitism is simply that of a Jewish community advocacy or action. It actually is anchored in very important parliamentary principles and precedents. I'll give you one example. I can give many. But in February 2015, the Canadian Parliament, that's all parties, unanimously adopted a resolution. It had three parts. The first said, alarmed at the escalation in anti-Semitism. This was 2015. I don't have to tell you today, 2022. The second calls on the Canadian government. This is all parliamentarians, unanimously, calls on the Canadian government to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in our domestic and foreign policy. And the third part was criticizing Israel as not anti-Semitic and saying so is wrong. But singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is discriminatory and hateful and anti-Semitic, and not saying so is dishonest. We can frame our action in terms of parliamentary principle and precedent. We need as well time does not permit me to go into, but we need allyship in this. In other words, anti-Semitism cannot be fought by Jews alone. Other minorities are also being targeted by hate. Indigenous people, Black, Asian claimant. So that is why we are now proposing in Canada a national action plan against hate, so that there will be allyship in that regard. And the social media, yes, it's targeting Jews, but it has become a vehicle for hate targeting other minorities, etc. And so we need to join together in the adoption of such legislation at this point with regard to combating both hate crimes and incendiary hate speech in the media. And I think I would close by saying that the important way to try to make the case is when people feel that they have a personal stake in it, that it's not just protecting Jews or that what's at stake at this point is our common humanity. That what is at stake at this point is the protection of our democracy. That the laundering of anti-Semitism under universal public values, the weaponization of those public values, is in fact undermining those universal public values. And that's why we all have to work together. Now, the Abraham Accords is an example of a coming together for the advancement of peace to benefit the peoples. What's important about the Abraham Accords is not just an agreement between states, it's a normalization of relations between peoples. And it's a normalization of relations in education, in agriculture, in health, and in common security. In other words, it's advancing the public good of the peoples involved. We should try to say that that is not being done, at the expense of or to the exclusion of to the Palestinian people, but we should seek to enhance that orbit and involve the Palestinians as well. But here too, when we speak about an Israeli-Palestinian peace and relationship, yes, it's right to call upon Israel with regard to things that Israel needs to do, but not to call on the Palestinians to undertake their own responsibilities is in fact to engage in the bigotry of soft or no expectations. And in fact, it's patronizing to ignore Palestinian rejectionism of any peace and not hold them to any account. So I think we should work on both fronts, enhancing the orbit of Abraham Accords, and I hope other countries will join, like Dakar. We speak of Saudi Arabia, but there are other possibilities. The recent Hamas war, I think, showed that Dakar might itself be a potential ally here too. And in particular, I think the Palestinian-Israeli issue of normalizing relations between peoples as we move towards an agreement between the two peoples.
Thank you.
Thank you. Romy, introduce yourself and say you're a law student. I think Irwin, this will be the final question.
Hi, Irwin. It's a great honor to listen to you today. I've heard you in South Africa. I'm also, I'm a lawyer, but very much a student still of international law and that. And I just was interested in your opinion of how we deal with international law. As you said, it's become, a norm of international law now that, Israel bashing and that has sort of become innate, and it seems like it's part of the structure of the UN as well. Obviously, you have the likes of Akil Noya at UN Watch and that, and your work, of course. But I was just saying, as a young lawyer wanting to get involved in the international law space as well as being a Zionist, it's hard to be part of both of those worlds. So I was just interested in how you think it's best to negotiate the international, this issue.
Well, and it's good to see you and to hear your question. I just was on the phone 2 days ago with Wendy Kahn, the Board of Jewish Deputies in South Africa. We were discussing the situation in South Africa, which appears to me to be worsening for reasons better, and I won't go into. I just referenced some of it. But I think the way to approach it is that it's not international law that's the problem. It's the weaponization of international law. And the weaponization of international law as part of the weaponization of universal human values. If we say that this is prejudicial to Israel, people will say, well, Israel deserves it. It's not prejudicial to Israel. I think what we've got to say is that the laundry of anti-Semitism under the protective cover of the UN, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, the struggle against racism, is not simply prejudicial to Jews. Rather, it erodes the integrity of the UN. It undermines the authority of international law. It corrupts the culture of human rights. It demeans the struggles against the real racism, against the real apartheid. So I think what we need to do is, just as they are instrumentalizing, international and all these other things, and laundering anti-Semitism thereby, I think what we have to say is, no, what's at stake here is, as I said, democracy, our common humanity, international law, the universal human rights. That's what's at work here. And what you're doing with the instrumentalization and weaponization of anti-Semitism, you're undermining all those universal values in your weaponizing of them. And we are, in fact, protecting those universal human values in our struggle against anti-Semitism. That would be the approach I would take.
Thank you so much. I suppose the other question is just whether you think like the UN Human Rights Council and that needs to be disbanded like it was beforehand. I know it's been reconstructed for the second time. Yeah.
Well, I think that the UN, the Human Rights Council, is a standing reminder at this point of a standing breach of its own founding canon and its own principles. Under the present guise, the UN Human Rights Council, certainly this recent commission of inquiry that was established, where one of the focal points of being a member of a commission of inquiry is that the members cannot have a reasonable apprehension of bias. In this instance, all three members of that commission of inquiry have not only a reasonable apprehension of bias, but a clear evidence of bias. So I think that the UN Commission of Inquiry has to adhere to its own requirements, or in fact, it should not be allowed to have that particular commission continue. And I don't want to speak yet about the disbanding of the UN Council. I think the first step should be to disband this recent Commission of Inquiry. For that, there's compelling evidence to do so.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So Irwin, on behalf of ISGAP and everybody here, really thank you very much for your work.
Enjoy your dinner and look forward to getting together at some port of call.
Thank you. I'm hoping to come to Montreal in the next few weeks. I'll let you know.
Okay, I'm still, I don't want to say confined to my home, but I've been asked to stay at home getting over COVID, so I'll be here.
All right. Take it easy. Feel well. Feel better. Thank you.
Take care, bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, cool. All right, so we're gonna wrap up soon. There's a few of us that are going for a special dinner with the Trends group. It will be in the same dining room that we have our lunch and breakfast. And then for everybody else, please come back here.
At the auditorium.
That's good. Okay, sorry, it's the auditorium downstairs where you get your coffee. Please be there in about 5 minutes to 8. There'll be a special session on the Abraham Accords and some of the issues that we're discussing with some other dignitaries.
So we have no breakout group today.
No breakout rooms. Have a nice
Oh,